A few years ago, I started to notice that a lot of people seem to respond differently to an injustice depending on whether they identify more with the perpetrator or the victim of that injustice. So, when an injustice transpires, and let's say there's a killer and a victim, if the killer has a different identity than the victim, whether their religion, their gender, their race, what have you, uh, I started to realize a lot of people, depending on which identity matched, that's who they would relate more with. So rather than identifying with and rooting for the victim in every situation, rather they would identify with whoever happened to be more similar to them in that scenario. So if the killer was the same race or gender or whatever as the person who's watching this on the news, then you would find that person relating more with and empathizing more with the killer than the victim. Um, and I first started to notice this strange phenomenon a few years ago with two particular events that were really shaping American society at the time. One being the Me Too movement, and the other being the Black Lives Matter protests. With the Me Too movement, the focus was heavily on gender, and with the Black Lives Matter protests, the focus was on race. So, of course, there's a ton of exceptions to this phenomenon I'm describing. People don't always tend to empathize with the person in the situation who matches their identity first. Some people do tend to empathize with the victim, regardless of identity. And that's wonderful. And that's why I'm making this video, basically to encourage that mentality and to point out the times when it doesn't happen and how that can really, really hurt all of us. So, with the Me Too movement, for example, there were a lot of men who supported the Me Too movement. This was a movement of calling out sexual abusers, typically powerful men who tended to get away with their crimes because of their power, their fame, their status, their wealth. And this was a movement largely led online by young women sharing their stories of how they had been silenced. And a lot of men were very supportive of this movement, and a lot of men have themselves been victimized in this manner as well. And so it's not to say that there was like this clear division along gender lines, but I did notice that some men during the discourse about the Me Too movement uh, were quicker to empathize. Like, let's say they have nothing to do with a situation, right? They're not a survivor of sexual assault, nor have they ever sexually assaulted anyone. Okay, assume that's the case. Assume you're just a random passerby who's a man who's reading all of these news stories, and I was able to pick up on a lot of reactions of passersby because I used to be a writing teacher, and a lot of my students, these young college students, would be reacting to these news stories we would discuss in class sometimes. And I started to pick up on this trend where their identity seemed to inform their reaction. So, were a lot of young men who, um, it's not like they were advocating for any harm to befall women or anything like that, but they would be so quick to empathize with the man in the situation instead of the woman, just because that, like, they can put themselves in the man's shoes more easily. It doesn't matter that the man in the situation, to them, it doesn't matter that that man committed some sort of atrocity against the woman. They can relate to the man, they can imagine being in the man's shoes, and that's the problem. That's the, like, empathy limitation that's actually causing injustice to spread. So sometimes there would be people in my classes who would or people I would encounter who would be very complaining about, like, what about false accusations? That was their biggest concern. So if you're a man, what are you more likely to be afraid of statistically when it comes to the Me Too movement conversation? You're afraid of being canceled because of a false accusation. So, like, your whole career could end, your life could end in a moment if someone claims that you did something horrible. So a lot of men had this genuine fear of, like, even if they didn't do anything, they're afraid that someone who has a grudge against them can just say that they did something. And there was this phrase going around at the time, believe women, that kind of made it sound like anything. It was trying to encourage women to speak out about their stories if they are survivors of abuse. But some men began to have this sincere worry of, well, what will happen if someone calls me out for something and they're believed by default and I'm not even given a chance? As a result of this concern, a lot of men had a negative defensive reaction to the Me Too movement, not because they're pro sexual assault, but because they empathize with the man in the situation and the possibility that they could one day find themselves on that end of the equation where someone's making a false accusation against them. False accusations are statistically extremely rare. So if they were approaching this situation from a purely logical standpoint, a purely moral standpoint, they should be overall supportive of what the Me Too movement was trying to encourage. Yet their first reaction for some of these men I encountered was defensiveness instead of encouragement and support. And that was because their identity was informing their morality. And the problem isn't that these men are quick to empathize with men. It's fine to try to empathize with everyone in the situation and look at the situation from different angles. The problem is their immediate empathy with the person they identified with prevented them from empathizing with the other person who is the victim, so the person who toward whom the empathy should be going first, right? So when you look at, men and women, what are they statistically thinking about in these conversations? What are they most afraid can happen to them in terms of how the situation might apply to them? um, a woman's first fear is getting raped, getting assaulted. A man's first fear might be more like getting falsely accused by some ex who has a vendetta against this person, and this is a convenient way to ruin his life. Or that's the way they sometimes present it, like, what if someone has a grudge against me and they use their identity as a woman to falsely accuse me? So because men are more afraid of the false accusation and women are more afraid of the assault, um, you can see why some men tended to be defensive and whereas women were more empathetic typically with the Me Too movement. The problem here is because of the way identity is informing people's reactions to the injustice, the initial injustice conversation gets overshadowed by these other conversations. So even though uh, a man getting falsely accused of raping a woman is statistically far less likely to happen than a woman actually getting raped, because half the population roughly is men, half the conversation suddenly took on this tone of, what about false accusations? What about false accusations? And so it's not that that conversation wasn't worth considering. It's that that conversation statistically should not have taken up 50% of the airtime and 50% of our energy collectively as a society. The vast majority of the focus should be on the vast majority of the problem, the pervasiveness of sexual abuse against women in Western society, and so many institutions silencing those survivors. But because some people struggle to empathize with victims when the perpetrators are more similar to their identity, we ended up instead having a conversation that was very distracted away from the fundamental issue, that being the actual widespread injustice in question. I realized I'd forgotten to don my kufiye. So for the next example, I'm going to try to be brief because I think the point is becoming clear, where um, one's identity is a distraction from who you should really be empathizing with in a situation, which is ideally everyone but the survivors first and foremost and centrally. So the other example I wanted to quickly illustrate is the reactions of many white people to the Black Lives Matter movement, where I saw some otherwise very compassionate, friendly people really, really struggling to empathize with a victim of a murder just because of his race. And the murder itself was racially motivated or racially informed. And that added to their defensiveness, actually. And it was really weird because it's like they lost the ability to hear themselves. Like, seriously, right now you are justifying a public execution of an innocent person, like using whatever they could to make it okay, because they are wanting to empathize with the white police officer who represents order and authority in Western society, instead of empathizing with the random citizen who ended up dying for no reason, who was killed for no reason that day, George Floyd. And it's really it was mind-boggling to witness people bend over backwards trying to justify this killing, and to wonder why are you so attached to justifying this killing? Why can't you say, oh, that's horrible, and agree that murder is wrong? It doesn't matter if a white cop is the murderer and a black man is the victim. They were saying, they were really bending over backwards trying to find ways to dehumanize the victim by saying, oh, there were drugs in his system at the time when he died. Why would having drugs in his system make a street execution morally justified, though? Did did the cop know there were drugs in his system? Would having drugs in his system make a street execution justified? Like, it didn't make any sense at all, but it was used to dehumanize him. Oh, he was some junkie addict, whatever, his life didn't matter. And that's why the Black Lives Matter movement is called that, Black Lives Matter, basically begging people to notice that Black lives are human lives as well, and to react with the same empathy and dignity they afford in their reactions should the victim have been a white person. It's almost like some white people felt as though if they were to acknowledge the killing of George Floyd as wrong, it's almost like they were saying that they were in the wrong or something. It's like they empathized so much, they identified so much with the white person instead of the black person in the situation, even though the white person was a cop who killed a citizen. And that, because they were so racially more drawn to the killer in the situation, they really felt the need, the urge to defend him no matter what, because to do otherwise would be to take on some blame for themselves, but that's not what the situation called for. And to maybe examine their own racial biases. And this situation is like even worse than the Me Too situation, because with the Me Too example, half the population is men. So the conversation really got derailed toward empathizing with the perpetrator before considering the survivor of the abuse. But with the George Floyd situation, the vast majority of American population is white. So guess what conversations dominated the circumstances surrounding George Floyd's killing? White people's concerns. So it really became a frustration where the injustice that had transpired was against a black individual and it was racially motivated. And yet, white people's concerns and considerations were made central to the conversation. I remember I used to actually come home crying the days I teach these classes where we talked about race, because I would be so disillusioned with my students The fact that they were willing to justify the murder of an innocent man, it kind of confirmed to me something that I was always afraid of, but I didn't want to accept as true, which is that the lives of minorities actually don't matter to a lot of people. Not just people in power, but like people in society and people who we care about and consider to be our neighbors and our coworkers and our friends. And the fact that this sort of empathy block was leading to such morally reprehensible conclusions about all of these important issues was really starting to get to me. And it all seemed to stem from this root of, it's not that the person is evil, it's that their brain is not even seeing the other logical track that it missed, because it's immediately being funneled. All of the logical and emotional energy is being funneled toward or in service to whoever they identify with. It's tribalism. And it's just upsetting that the defensiveness is, even if it's natural to feel defensive, but it's upsetting that that reaction is so strong that they weren't able to put it aside and let their morality be stronger, and let their willingness to recognize that an injustice had transpired, and it shouldn't matter. The identity of the killer and the identity of the victim shouldn't affect your ability to recognize evil as evil. And yet it consistently does. And that brings me to my primary reason for making today's video. America, your leaders have spent the past several decades doing everything they can to dehumanize Arabs and Muslims. Perhaps they put in too much effort because they didn't even need to try that hard. Uh, it's clear that for many people, the tribalism in their brains was already so quick to empathize with their own kind instead of with the oppressed. You have spent the past 2 years watching a live stream genocide, largely in silence. And I literally don't know what to say anymore and what to do anymore. And as the genocide escalates before our eyes, with more than 100 civilians murdered per day, the vast majority women and children, with journalists and doctors being targeted in front of our eyes, with the population being starved to death, and then told after months of starvation to the brink of famine, told they can fight over scraps of food if they go to military distribution centers where they get aid from the very people who have been committing genocide against them. But because the identity of these victims of ethnic cleansing and apartheid and genocide is an identity that has been so dehumanized for so long, and their rights so fundamentally overlooked, and because your identity aligns so much more closely with that of the killers, this topic makes you uncomfortable. Stomach some discomfort before more children die. I know my words don't apply to all Americans because I have spent the past 2 years standing in the streets with signs alongside Americans whose hearts bleed for Palestine perhaps even more strongly than my own. Their compassion humbles me and gives me so much hope. I know this empathy block is possible to overcome. Some people might not have it in the first place, but for all of us, that tribalism in our brain is natural. We all have to be willing to recognize wrong as wrong, regardless of who we are. And when your identity comes first, when your identity takes precedence over your morality, you will end up betraying your own professed core principles. I've seen this. I keep seeing this happen. I've lost some friends this year after they have made it very clear to me that human lives don't matter to them if they're not sharing their identity. It doesn't matter that our money as American taxpayers is funding the massacres. To them, their identity as Democrats, as Republicans, their identity as Americans is so strongly ingrained in their heads that they feel they would be betraying their nation to be willing to look this issue in the eye. Or perhaps their brains can't handle it. They've spent their entire lives being told and believing that they are the good guys, that they have the solutions for how humanity should live. And for them to look at their own leaders who they voted for and to be willing to recognize what their leaders have been not just complicit in, but have taken the charge in enacting against innocent lives. Perhaps the conclusion is too horrific for their brains to accept, and so instead they shut it out because they thought they were the ones who had finally gotten it right. Republicans claim to care about free speech. They have this belief about minimal government oversight, right? They claim their whole thing is keep the government small, let people live their lives, let the government stay out of it. And yet, their conservative identities over the past 2 years have prevented them from recognizing the fascistic repression of free speech when it comes to criticizing Israel for its genocide against Palestine. Democrats claim to care about equality, yet their liberal identities have prevented them from recognizing Western imperialism as the ultimate threat to equality. Over the past 2 years, I've seen Democrats talk about all these different human rights issues and social justice issues and everything except for Palestine, to the point where it became an acronym, PEP, Progressive Except for Palestine. Suddenly, women's rights doesn't matter when it comes to Palestine. Suddenly, human rights doesn't matter. Children's rights don't matter. Nothing matters when it comes to Palestine. They don't want to talk about it. They get mad at me if I bring it up because it's very inconvenient and they're focused on their own problems. And then it starts calling so many things into question, like when you said that you supported the Black Lives Matter movement. Did you mean it? Did you mean what you said when you stood with the survivors of sexual assault during the MeToo movement? Like everything they claim to stand for is being recontextualized by their refusal to stand for Palestine through this genocide. Do you believe in human rights or do you not? Do you believe in it until it becomes inconvenient for you personally? And they don't want to let go of that liberal identity because it's pretty much their religion at this point. If your religion endorses genocide, it's time to look for a new faith. Even when it comes to Jewish people, where in the United States you have the Jewish Voice for Peace, this amazing organization of Jewish people who wear those shirts that say "not in our name," not in my name, basically saying this genocide, I denounce it. My religion does not teach this. I am picking justice over identity. I am aligning more and identifying more with the Palestine liberation movement, and I stand in solidarity with Palestine instead of with Israel because I am choosing morals over identity. Those Jewish people are the best example of what this phenomenon can look like, where it's actually really possible to get rid of that empathy blockade. And a lot of these amazing, really brave people have lost family members or community because of their brave stand, their principled stand with what's right instead of with what privileges them. It hasn't been easy for them at all. This has been incredibly difficult time for them, just as it has been for Muslims and Arabs. And for such Jewish people who have really inspired us throughout this movement over the course of this genocide, um, it's been really incredible to listen to their stories of them basically unprogramming the Zionism that they were raised to accept, pressured to accept, told, stories about the Holocaust repeatedly, and basically told if you don't now, because of the Holocaust, support your people now in committing a new Holocaust against a completely different group of people, if you don't blindly align with everything this so-called Jewish state does, you are a traitor to your people. You are a self-loathing Jew. That's the term that would be used against them. And so they've really been pressured. And I understand for a lot of Jewish people, Zionism is an identity, not an ideology, and it's visceral. But it's not that they want to be supporters of genocide, but for some Jewish people in the United States who have not been willing to face these uncomfortable conversations, it's not that they want to be supporters of genocide, it's that they won't let genocide stop them from supporting the genocidal nation they've been brainwashed and pressured to identify with. And that's a problem because that nation privileges them tremendously. The entire world order is set up to privilege them at the direct expense of the children of Palestine. So for these people who have been brought up under the ideology of Zionism, I understand that it's a visceral personal identity that connects to their ancestors. They have been told all of these things about their family and what they've been through. Your legacy, it's up to you to decide it. You can choose to be someone who, as the as the descendant of Holocaust survivors, understands struggle when they see it. When you see oppression, you recognize it because your ancestors have been through it. And as a result, if anything, that could make you more willing to stand with justice, even against your own people. That might seem like a tall order, but so many amazing Jewish people have risen to the occasion where so many liberals have really failed and let the world down. And finally, I want to address Muslims and Arabs because they have failed tremendously as well. Your own religion teaches you that you are required to stand up and fight oppression. Islam should be your moral compass. Your religion is whatever your heart submits to. Have you been submitting primarily to Ar-Rahman, the most merciful? Because if you have, then you should not have been silent about the genocide. You should not have lived passively and acted like it's not your problem. Many Muslims within the Ummah seem to identify with their country instead of with the Ummah. Ummah meaning the global Muslim community. That's exactly what the colonizer set out to do, to divide us and make us feel like we don't have a common cause, which is really unfortunate because all of us are suffering in our respective countries from the same enemy. And if we were to unite, we might actually see some results, inshallah. But no, instead you have Syrians saying, we're tired, we've been through so much, we're just going to focus on Syria. And Iraqis saying, we're tired, we've been through so much, we're just going to focus on Iraq. And so on and so forth. And it's just the ultimate letdown because all of you have been bombed by Israel. All of you, your countries were destroyed because of Zionism. And the fact that you can't see it or you don't want to recognize it because the enemy seems too enormous is very frustrating. By focusing only on your own people's struggles and neglecting Palestine through this hellish, sadistic genocide, you are actually letting them down and endangering your own people. We can only win this fight if people of conscience around the world unite. We need to start recognizing nationalism as a form of shirk. We live in perhaps the first era since Islam was founded in which Muslims don't have a global power. There are plenty of Muslim countries, and those countries have leaders, but those leaders are very clearly puppets of the colonizer. They are tyrannical to their own people. They do not serve their own people's interests. Their people are terrified of speaking out against their own governments because these governments are these puppet organizations that serve the Western Empire. The fact that that still isn't obvious to everyone really freaks me out. When people keep saying, where are the Muslim leaders? Where are the Arab leaders? Why aren't they standing for Palestine? Where are the Muslim and Arab leaders? They were murdered. They've been destroyed systematically over the past century, several centuries. Have you not been paying attention? We don't have any leaders. Israel made sure of it. Anyone who stands for the Muslims gets put down. This is all because of Israel's expansion project, their settler colony project. And if you think this problem, this Palestinian genocide is not going to touch you, if you're living in the Arab world, you're mistaken. You're next. And it's not even a grim prediction. It's happening. It's been happening the entire time. Israel has been bombing all of the different Arab countries, or the United States would bomb them on Israel's behalf, which is exactly what happened to Iraq, my country. So with Middle Eastern countries, their government structure is either explicitly pro-Zionism, in which case Israel doesn't bomb them because why would they? That country does their bidding against the will of its own people and against the interests of its own people. Or if that country dares not fall in line with the Zionist oppressor, then that country will be bombed and its people will be treated as incredibly disposable on the international stage. We've been seeing this happen this year with Yemen. May Allah protect the steadfast people of Yemen. They might be the only Arab country outside of Palestine who has made the cause of Palestinian liberation central and connected to their own fate as Yemeni people, where the people come out in masses supporting Palestine and demanding their liberation and an end to the genocide. So when people say none of us are free until Palestine is free, they mean it. They mean it literally. Our lives, regardless of who you are, our lives are disposable for Israel's sake. That's how the people in power on the world stage today feel. If you're Muslim, if you're Arab, it's obvious that that's the case. But even if you're American, even if you're Jewish, Netanyahu not caring to rescue the hostages, he wishes they were dead so that he can carry out his genocide without pressure from the public. Israel is the least safe place for a person to be Jewish, clearly. If you're American, all of your money is going to fund a war against children instead of funding your healthcare, your education, your all of the basic needs that your government is supposed to be using your money to provide you with. We are all disposable because of Israel. This world order on a global scale needs to fall. Obviously, it's dying, but it's not happening fast enough. And I don't want to keep watching children starving to death and getting massacred on my screen. Even if this issue did not touch me, even if my money were not covered in blood, it's still not okay, and I still feel obligated to speak out, and so should you. It really doesn't serve us to continue thinking in such a small way. Much like I feel frustrated when I find Americans looking to their leaders for help out of the problems that their leaders have caused. Call your senators, beg for crumbs from the war criminals who are committing the war crimes. That's ridiculous. And similarly, it's ridiculous for people in Muslim countries to continue to think their problems are not part of a bigger picture and to say we're too tired to focus on these other issues because we have our own. Your own problems are a symptom of something bigger. If you don't focus on the ummah, you are going to suffer. And where is the solidarity? These are not the teachings of our Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, who taught us that the Muslim ummah is like a body. When one part is hurt, the whole body is in fever. Really, when I'm talking about the Muslim and Arab betrayal of Palestine, I'm not referring to the leaders, because I understand the leaders are Zionists themselves. I'm talking about the people and their silence and their indifference. So, what can we do when we live under leaders who are war criminals, whether we live in the East or the West? What can we do? Something. That's the answer. Seriously, that's all I came on here to say today. Literally, just do something. Like, the silence is not working. This is not acceptable. Make clear that you are not okay. Public pressure, public outrage does move the needle. And if everyone were to voice how they're actually feeling about Palestine, Palestinians would not still be in suffering today. The first step is to recognize the size of the problem and to stop seeking a solution from the wrong source. And then start affecting change in a local level. Each of us is just one person, but the question is what you can do. Are you keeping up with the news? Are you speaking out about the atrocities in your local circles? Make it your problem, because it is. If your allegiance is to your country instead of your morals, instead of to al-haq, al-adl, the truth, the justice, these are names of Allah, meaning the fundamental moral principles that guide us. If your allegiance is not to those fundamental principles, but rather to the arbitrary country in which you happen to be born, then you are actually going to be hurting your country and your principles. Allah alone can help us through this extreme time of trial. We need to show a willingness to be helped. We need to be receptive to the world around us and open our eyes to the extreme injustice of this era we're living through and see the obvious connections between all of our shared struggles. We need to rise in solidarity together and speak out together against the enemy. The enemy is united, so we cannot be divided. I remember hearing from a doctor who had come back from Gaza, from a mission in Gaza. He was saying that the people of Palestine, they don't ask Muslims for help anymore. They ask non-Muslims because they have been let down by the Muslims again and again and again, their own brothers and sisters. He also said that he'd heard Palestinians in Gaza praying against their fellow Arabs before praying against the Zionist enemy, saying they expected the Zionists to hurt them, but they did not expect this betrayal from the fellow Arabs. That should terrify you. If you are an Arab who has been silent during this genocide, if you are a Muslim and you believe in the hadith about fearing the dua, the prayer of the oppressed, it should terrify you to learn that the victims of the most horrific genocide of our time, the reason we've all been put on this earth, I believe, is to bear witness and fight this evil. This is the test of our time. And if you have made yourself a side character in this era by ignoring the test of our time, what are you living for? It should terrify you to learn that ignoring that might have earned you a plea from the oppressed for God to hold you accountable for your silence. I ended with an interesting example because it might seem to contradict my initial message, where I'm basically trying to argue that we should be empathizing with the oppressed instead of with those we identify with. Essentially, identity shouldn't factor into our considerations. But then toward the end of this video, I've been describing the Muslim and Arab betrayal of Palestinians, who are also largely Muslim and Arab. That situation is kind of a unique reverse example where usually a person tends to side with whoever they identify with rather than whoever is oppressed. But in this weird reverse scenario, people are siding against the people they identify with because those people have been so dehumanized. It's so unpopular to hitch your horse to the wagon of Palestine. It's so disempowering on the global stage that even fellow Arabs, even fellow Muslims have been willing, all too willing, to throw Palestinians under the bus and throw them to the wolves. So essentially, my point still stands. Whether you identify with the oppressed, whether you wish to identify with the oppressor, whether you, regardless of your position, it just shouldn't matter at all. Wrong is wrong is wrong, and it just doesn't matter who you are and what angle you're looking at it from. If there's an oppressor and there's an oppressed on a small scale, on a systemic scale, we are required to recognize that. People who are privileged by the oppression need to make their voices even louder, as Jewish people do, to speak out against the hateful ideology of Zionism. And I do believe that Muslims need to follow their example and be more willing to speak out for the people of Palestine. I think some of us, like some Muslims, don't speak out because it doesn't feel good. It doesn't taste good to kind of, it's almost like you're playing a victim role. It feels very disempowering. But we are being victimized. And really, it's not about our identity and it's not about us at all right now. Obviously, all of our rights are being affected. The global powers are willing to sacrifice all of us for the sake of Israel. But the most urgent attention right now should go to the most impacted victims of this evil world order, which is the people of Palestine. They're still starving. They're still being bombarded. Allahu alam how many people have been murdered just in the time I've spent working on this video. We really need to put all of our different perspectives to the side and just do what needs to be done to put an end to this extreme evil. Take to the streets, paint a sign, make a social media post, talk to your friends and family. Stop ignoring this. It's not going away. It's getting worse. It's been allowed to get this bad because so many people have been so silent for so long. No, it's not fun to talk about. It might be uncomfortable depending on your identity. It doesn't matter. Taste the shame and swallow it. Shame on all of us. Palestine, we are eternally sorry. May Allah free you. I'm going to end with a beautiful Qur'an verse, a very famous Qur'an verse that summarizes everything I just said better than I could ever say it. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين بالقسط شهداء لله ولو على أنفسكم أو الوالدين والأقربين إن يكن غنيا أو فقيرا فالله أولى بهما فلا تتبعوا الهوى أن تعدلوا وإن تلووا أو تعرضوا فإن الله كان بما تعملون خبيرا. صدق الله العظيم.